Buonasera, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Center for Italian Modern Art. My name is Nicola Lucchi, I'm the director here at CIMA, and for those of you who join us for the first time, and there are a few, although we are few, there are a few that are here for the first time. CIMA is a non-profit research and exhibition center established in 2013 by art historian and curator Laura Mattioli, with a mission to foster knowledge, appreciation, and dialogue around modern and contemporary Italian art in an international context. We accomplish this mission by presenting temporary exhibitions of modern Italian artists, such as the one that surrounds us today, which is entitled Nanni Balestrini, Art as Political Action, curated by Marco Scotini. Balestrini is better known in the United States as a writer. His books are translated and published by Verso Books. But in the 60s and 70s, he had an involvement with visual poetry, with the world of experimental music, with the left-wing politics of the era, especially the student movement and the workers' movement that characterized political activism in Italy during the 1970s. Alongside each exhibition, we run a fellowship program for doctoral and postdoctoral students in art history, Italian studies, and related disciplines. These students, we have a call for applications basically for every exhibition, and we receive research projects related to the subjects of the shows, and the students who are selected from our committee will join us in residence for the duration of the show to study the artworks and participate in events that help us explore in detail various facets of the historical moment discussed by our exhibition. Now, this commitment to dialogue this year also extended to this series of talks with contemporary artists titled Persisting Matters, which was conceived by my colleague Adriana Sadowska and myself, and that Adriana will introduce in detail in a moment. And I'm very happy that tonight we have with us an artist and an art historian from out of town that has not happened quite yet, which is a reminder to all of us that the artistic discourse in the United States does not start and finish in New York City. As Adriana will discuss later, the Persisting Matters series was conceived as a program to accompany an exhibition where the artist, Cagli, came to the United States for an exile during fascism. And while he was in New York, so important was also the time that he spent in California, Arizona, Oregon, and other parts of the country. So tonight is a welcome reminder of the great variety of creative experience and artistic communities that one can find not only in this city, but truly across the country. Please help me welcome my colleague Adriana Sadowska, Development and Special Programs Manager at CIMA, who has been a real champion of this project and has done an immense job to make this talk happen, and as well as the mini documentary that we will screen briefly, which included a site visit in Austin, Texas, which gives us a nice change of pace in the New York-dominated scenery we have observed so far. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nicola, and thank you, Laura, and everyone at CIMA for supporting this project. And it is my pleasure to introduce the series here tonight. Persisting Matters is a series of talks conceived in relation to 2023-24 exhibition, Transatlantic Bridges, Corrado Cagli, 1938 to 1948. The exhibition was dedicated to Jewish Italian artist and his years in exile in the US due to Italy's racial laws. Cagli saw his practice as an instrument of resistance and critique to power in times of displacement and trauma. Questions of gender, racism, political oppression, and resilience through art and community practices were central to his work. And considering how relevant these themes are today, we have developed, with the support of the grant from the Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts, a series of conversations between contemporary artists, scholars, and critics, looking at how art practices today engage with these subjects. By inviting diverse artists who embrace multifaceted experimental practices, The talks highlight how each artist approaches these themes in their individual context. So far, the series has featured 6 artists: Hilary Harkness, Leslie Hewitt, Sheila Pepe, Kambui Olujimi, Juan Sanchez, and Bea Scacha. The recordings of these talks are available on Chima's website, and I hope you will take a look and listen. The series is ongoing. On June 13, we will present a talk with Michael Rakowitz, who is from New York but is currently based in Chicago. And now, it is my pleasure to welcome Tammie Rubin and Ellen Tani. We will start with a screening of a short documentary about Rubin's practice, produced for this occasion with our colleagues from Owen Films. This will be followed by a panel discussion and a Q&A. After the talk, please join us for a glass of Prosecco, light refreshments, and a conversation about the topic we are presenting today. And now let me introduce our speakers. Tammie Rubin is a ceramic sculptor and installation artist whose practice considers the power of objects and coded symbols as signifiers and mythic relics. Her artwork weaves familiar historical and literary narratives of Black American citizenry, migration, autonomy, and faith. Rubin is the recipient of multiple residential fellowships, the winner of the 2022 Tito's Prize, and a 2024 USA Fellow in Craft. Rubin has exhibited in prominent museums across the US, including at the Hessel Museum of Art at Bard College, New York, Indianapolis Art Center, Indiana, and the Houston Center for Contemporary Craft in Texas. Rubin's artwork has received reviews in publications such as Art Forum, The Brooklyn Rail, Oxford American, Art in America, and Hyperallergic. She is a member of ICOSA Collective, a nonprofit artist-run gallery. Born and raised in Chicago, Rubin lives in Austin, Texas, where she is Associate Professor of Ceramics and Sculpture at St. Edward's University. She is represented by Gallery Urbane in Dallas, Texas, and C24 Gallery in New York. Ellen Tani is an art historian and curator whose research in the history of modern and contemporary art is informed by feminist, critical race, and disability theory. She is currently Assistant Professor of Art History at Rochester Institute of Technology. She has held curatorial positions at the ICA Boston and the Bowdoin College Museum of Art. Most recently, she co-curated the exhibition Retro Action in 2024 with Charles Gaines, Kate Fall, and Homi Baba, which took place at the New York and Los Angeles locations of Hauser and Wirth Gallery. Her research has been supported by the Clark Research and Academic Program, the Getty Research Institute, the Center for Advanced Study in Visual Arts, Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity at Stanford University, and Carter G. Woodson Institute for African and African American Studies at the University of Virginia. Her scholarship has appeared at Art Journal, Panorama, and American Quarterly, and her current book manuscript explores the career of conceptual artist Charles Gaines. And with this, let's watch the documentary.
The role of art has always been to act as a mirror. I'm contemplating my own experience as a Black woman in America and my family history and lineage. And how I do that is through the sculptural works that I create. I don't necessarily set out to think of my art as like political art, but as a civilian, I'm a political being. If you are engaging in critical thinking, it's sort of a rebellion to our kind of passive culture of entertainment. My name is Tammie Rubin. I was born on the south side of Chicago, the Auburn Grisham neighborhood, and I live in Austin, Texas. Austin is a pretty creative area. There are a lot of artist studios and galleries that are here. It's interesting to think about how I became a sculptor. I was always a very curious person, creative person, but I didn't have a place to put it. In high school, grade school, I didn't have many art classes. I went to parochial school. And when we did have art, it was all 2D. And so it wasn't until college that I started to take ceramic classes. I felt like this is it. This is the thing that I've been looking for, and I've kind of never looked back. When I started being a sculptor in ceramics, I was working with the figure a lot, and it really started to feel like a crutch. So I completely changed my practice after grad school, and that's when I began working in a more abstract way, cloning everyday materials. I learned how to cast and mold make, and so over time, it's just having these space to put different kinds of materiality, practices, conceptual ideas into the work, and not being so outcome driven specifically, but thinking about like that journey along the way through the research and the experimenting becoming much more important, and then seeing what the outcome is. I'm here at my studio. It's called And Studio. It's owned and operated by artist Lisa Woods. It feels really kind of special to be like in a new space, and to have that space run by a Black woman feels particularly poignant for me. There are community groups that I engage with that are important to my practice as an artist. It really leads to an exchange of ideas and kind of gathering and convening. One of them is the collective I'm part of called ICOSA. And ICOSA is a 20-sided die, and there are 20 artists in this collective. This exhibition is an exhibition with myself and a collective member, Erin Cunningham. And we were both thinking about the role of like women's labor, both domestically within the home and then in industries. A lot of it has to do with working with the hand. So both my grandmothers were domestic workers. Her grandmother was also a maid. So thinking about how the lineage of labor has led me here as an artist who also works very much with like the idea of labor and then producing with my hands. For instance, there are 2 sets of hands. One is a set of my hand that Erin took of me, in this gesture of like giving or receiving or demanding more. And hers is a gesture that her grandmother did, where her grandmother would be giving like bad news or having like a serious conversation where she would kind of sweep the table. This is my first video piece that I've shown. It's called Shifts. I think of the Mylar balloons that are in space as kind of like bodies that are in this kind of stasis. And so they are affected by any kind of movement that happens within the room, so any kind of air displacement. And so I thought that there was something really kind of intriguing about that, and the idea that they seem like they're just floating on their own, although they are tethered. And the thing that they're tethered to is this repeating conical form that it's in my work, and in this case they're bells, so it's almost like memorial of these groupings or these bodies moving through space. This project is called the Pylon Project, so it's a sign that is here at Canopy by an organization called Topo. So my piece is called Monkey Wrench, North Star, Shoe Fly. And for this one, I was taking quilt patterns that were used by the Underground Railroad, and these were thought of as ways to let people who were escaping slavery to know like when to prepare, when to get ready. Each of these symbols denotes a different thing, like the North Star means follow the path towards north, towards freedom, and not just literally, but like in a metaphorical way that we should all be kind of striving for continual freedom wherever we see constraints that are put upon us. The Always and Forever Ever series, the Citizen series, and Prayer Fans are part of my first solo exhibition in New York. The title of the show is Points of Origin at C24 Gallery in Chelsea. Citizen Series is a series of plotted drawings that I am using my mother and her sisters and my grandmother to start this conversation of a new project. It's I Am Woman, I Am Home, I Am Labor. And thinking about them in terms of like the sacrifices that they made and their labor and the way that they brought, they're kind of the core of the family. And so in the citizen drawings, there is a deconstructed image of each one of them. And in that deconstructed image, there's also me making them into saints. But instead of a halo, there's actually a collard green or a turnip green that kind of frames them and makes them into these sainted, heroic figures. In my work, I am thinking about myself in place of history as an American citizen. So if I'm contemplating myself that way, then of course it talks about origin, it talks about history, it talks about policy. These contemplations that I'm having, other people have had. Thinking about my family narrative of like the Great Migration has been a way for me to have a larger conversation of like Black history in the United States, because my family's experience was not unique. So the fact of like starting familiar and thinking outwardly about how the historical context of my family's history is a shared history with all Black Americans who are part of this Great Migration. And I'm talking about Black bodies moving through the United States, moving through spaces, and this continuous seeking for the acknowledgement of our citizenship here as Americans. So I'm not thinking of these as separate. This is not Black history that's separate from American history. This is American history. And making these objects cements that in my mind.
For this about sort of the various facets of your different projects. So the film was really illustrative in terms of thinking about all of these things together. And I want to come back to something that you opened the film with, which is that you talk about the function of art, or the purpose of art being as a mirror. And you describe that as a means for you to contemplate your own past. And I'm wondering if you could share how you envision this work functioning as a mirror for the viewer to see themselves in or in relation to. In part because the handmade quality of the work invites a kind of tactile relationship, right, to its own making, where we can imagine, our bodies in place of yours, maybe, right, in the making of them, the use of everyday objects, these kind of clones, as you describe them, of everyday objects, and also references to, domestic spaces and the installational environments that you also create, I think all speak to worlds other than your selfhood. Mm-hmm. And so I would like to hear you kind of think about that mirroring function of the work.
Well, I think when I was saying about a mirror, I wasn't thinking about me so much as an individual, but I was thinking about the mirroring of like history. And so thinking specifically as almost using my family's experience as an kind of an avatar for the experience of many Black Americans, and thinking about the way that I hadn't seen that through objects, right? And I got to a place where, you know, I had been so familiar with the immigrant experience. You know, it's something that, you know, I read about and watch movies, and it made me think like where I saw so many familiarities in those stories with my family stories as migrants from south to north, right? And so it's like, but where's that story? Like, I don't, you know, I see it, but I don't see it through objecthood. So it also made me think about placing these stories, these narratives, and pairing them with the history of this country through object and through kind of like totemic ways of seeing these objects. And all my work is really based on things that already exist, so there's a sense of accessibility or familiarity, even though the context of what they are now is different from whatever the original industrial domestic object is. So I feel like that's a way of like an entry point for people. It's like something that seems familiar, but you're not exactly sure, like what's the context now? This idea of like intimacy of the objects, having to get close to explore, and once you get close, is that this kind of like push-pull that happens of seeing the form versus the kind of like the surface, like this kind of visual language that I'm embedding into the surface of the work. And it is definitely about like this idea of like tactility and also like sensualness and the way that you want to, you know, people say that they want to touch, they want to lick, they want to investigate further, but also sometimes feeling a little bit off-putting in some of the way that the objects are grouped together.
Yeah, I would love to, maybe we can scroll through some of the ways in which the work can be off-putting. Because there's this tension between the abstraction, right, and the openness of abstraction as a formal language in the work, but then all of the kind of different evocative directions that can go in, especially when we're looking at something like a conical form with eye holes, right? So yeah, I you know, looking at, for example, one of these works alone is very different than looking at a grouping, right, or a collective of these entities that, you know, have a kind of personified presence because we associate them with a figure. And maybe this is a way too of, you know, we could jump later to a conversation around your decision to depart from figuration. Right, and then what you retain actually from that in the work, because it's there.
It's still there, yeah. It's totally there. There's presence there, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, right.
Yeah, but let's talk about this particular form, the conical form.
Yeah, so the conical form is a form I'd been working with for quite a while, and the way that it has changed in these groupings happened after I moved to Austin, Texas. So I was moving to take a job at a university. As in academia, you often do. You have to make some decisions about where you're going to live based on your job. And it made me kind of think about the fact that I was going to be moving south and my parents had moved north, and that I still had relatives that, you know, kind of went back and forth, and thinking about my own journey of like, you know, I'm from Chicago, I lived in Seattle, and then I moved to Texas, and so all of these different things, and like what had to happen historically, policy-wise, culturally, for me to even feel comfortable with that, right? And my parents are both deceased. And so it made me think about them in a American context of history, of them being as part of this migration and that continuance. And, you know, thinking even about what they're saying is like the reverse migration, where, you know, the generations are going back to kind of southern places now, right? This idea of like what they thought that they were going to encounter did not really wasn't really true, right? So this freedom that they thought they were going to get, there was always these other policy restraints that were kind of put upon them, right? So, you know, where you live, where your kids could go to school, how much your house was going to be worth, even if you bought it and you did all the things you were supposed supposed to do all of these things.
Yeah, it's
that
like the
are
weaponization of infrastructure.
Exactly, right. So with the conical forms being put this way, then they become to reference a variety of things, the Ku Klux Klan hood, but I'm also thinking about the dunce cap, thinking about like caution cones, thinking about things like helmets, West African headdresses, thinking about the papal church. And it really made me think about how these stories that we tell about power, and thinking about the Ku Klux Klan as like some guys that just go get a sheet. And it's like, no, they're looking at pageantry, they're looking at costumes or hoods of power. And like, what's one of the biggest power? The papal church, right? So you see these hoods that are still worn as part of atonement ceremonies, the Brothers of the Nazarene, the Capoeira, that happened during Easter week, right? And so also seeing how these kind of hooded figures show up in art history, so Hieronymus Bosch paintings, for instance, or in like cultural references that you see these cone figures happen over and over and over again. But the references changed based on the historical context. So that's something really interesting to me, is like why there are certain forms, certain objects that repeat. Like hundreds and hundreds of years, they repeat, right?
Yeah.
And
well, yeah, these representations of power.
Yeah, they keep repeating. And so that was what was interesting to me about like that you could kind of dive deeper. And on the surface becomes this way for me to talk about like bodies moving through space, talk about data, like where people have moved to, where they left, thinking about locations of like lynching, thinking about locations of like milestones. And so it becomes taking these things that I'm looking at and reading and transforming it into a kind of a tactile visual language that happens through abstraction on the surface.
As you're talking, I'm thinking about other artists who've used this representation of power. And on the one hand, you have someone like Gary Simmons, right, who's like literally making white hoods, and as you know, thinking about this as using them more as a ready-made object rather than like an abstract language that can serve as a point of departure in your various translations of, right, and references to that object, and how differently we respond to those things. And on the other hand, somebody like Philip Guston, right, who's like thinking about the hooded Klan figure as this kind of in a very metaphorical way, and recontextualizing this form in these mysterious interiors and like cityscapes. And with your work, you're doing something different than either of those artists, because you're kind of allowing the abstraction of that form itself, right? The conical form, which is like kind of a perfect volume in a way. But then rendering it through the information on its surface are so specific. And so kind of grounding in a particular context. And at the same time, that context doesn't point to anyone or anything, right? The surface adornment, right? They're all kind of representations of, I guess, like systemic conditions in a sense, right? Maps, infrastructures.
Yeah, I feel like there's a lot of amazing academics who have written very intriguing books about this in journals, and I'm an artist, right? So the way that I'm thinking about these things is in a visual context. And so the research is one thing, but then how it's like used, how I use it almost like in an intuitive way when I'm actually working is something, different. And what resonance of that is there as the viewer is looking, right? So if they want more specifics, they can have them, but I want them to have kind of a, like a visceral experience, an experience of like wanting to continue to engage and to look, right? I feel like this idea of like the movements and like kind of portals or magical thinking or like, faith, all of those things in horror are all there. It's because we're not, like, it's not ever one thing, right? It's many things, right? And they happen at the same time, so.
I want to ask you a question about the development of work in series, too, because you know, I guess the question I have is is there an origin point to this particular series? Is there a primary object that you made first that then becomes a point of response and departure in the next forms that you make, right? And then as you're thinking about them as a kind of grouping, do you respond to the last thing that you've made? Or like when you work intuitively in this way, or do you have in your mind, you know, a range of, you know, kind of information that you want to include on the surfaces of these works, or is it more?
I mean, it evolves like depending on what I'm thinking about. So, for instance, like I think coming up ahead, we'll like see an image of a grouping of Always and Forever Ever, where I was really thinking about congressional districts, and I was thinking about congressional districts because I now live in a place where my vote doesn't count very much, right? And that was kind of new for me to think of it in such a specific way. So I live in Austin, and the congressional district I'm part of actually touches almost to Houston. Houston is 2.5 hours away. Right, so we have these really big blue cities in the state. And when we vote, it doesn't count as much because of the way that the congressional districts are drawn, right? And so from the outside, when people look at like why is Texas like that? And you're like, well, there are people who are wanting to change things, but it's been kind of rigged for you not to be able to do that.
And through like a means of shaping space and mark making.
Yes, exactly. And so just
amazing.
even looking at like these like congressional districts, not only in Texas and other places, they really become these abstract forms. And you're like, how is that, what is that based on, right? And so they become kind of these, like I said, like these abstractions of people, right? And like how these people are being placed into these boundaries based on certain agendas, right? It's supposed to be on population, but like, who are these constituents? What do these constituents all have in common? How are they being either grouped together, or how are they kind of like they're kind of being like dissipated, right? So there are things like that that become kind of interesting to me, and so then that series, in that work, there may be an exploration of those forms in that grouping. The work that I was making before, and I have, you know, I go back and forth, is this installation work as well. And so when I said I was using the conical form before, so this is Silence, Magical Thinking in Progress, Part 2. And I think it becomes more clear of the other everyday objects that I'm using. So it's everything from catering plastic to like vintage lighting to toys, like to like a very kind of like trivial things that are often like made to like house other things or to be temporary, or things that you don't necessarily look at but that have a form that is really interesting to me. And so the idea of like these cloning these everyday forms and then deconstructing them and reconstructing them. And in this case, they become these listening devices based on voice pipes. So voice pipes are like pre-telephone. And so there would be through buildings like warships, and then at businesses, there would be these pipes that would go all the way through, and then you would talk through them so that you could hear, right? They would even have them in Victorian houses where instead of like a doorbell, there would be a place where you could actually, just like an opening that you could be magnified, so magnify the voice. And so I always have kind of this interest in magical thinking or the magical objects, or this idea of these like contraptions that, you know, might work on this idea of belief. And I'm sure it's because I was raised like Lutheran, and so I went to grade school, high school, and just this idea of like that you can have like this communication, this unseen communication, and that you can make a difference through your prayer or from wishfulness or things like that.
You're like a real Lutheran. I was Lutheran light. Did not get that in my Lutheran upbringing.
Oh no? Didn't you have a bunch of like objects and things like that? Like mosaics and the chalices and communion and no communion?
I mean, yes.
Okay,
we did.
like, I mean, that's pretty ritualistic.
Yes, and when I was looking at this, I was thinking chalice.
Yes.
Definitely.
Yeah.
It was very Lutheran light.
Okay. Yeah, no, I mean, I feel like those were the things that were really kind of confusing to me. Like, we believe this, and these other people believe this, but we're using the same mechanism. So, Lutherans, like, you believe that when the wine it's metaphorical, but if you're Catholic, you believe it's literal, right? That this is now blood. Versus,
here is the connection now to this series, Forever and Ever, Always and Forever, right? Is that we invest these objects with a kind of faith in their power to transform or manifest thought and belief.
Yeah, definitely, and there's an absurdity in it, right? Because if you tell these stories and people have no context for it, it does not make any sense, right? But it's the idea of the group mentality that gives it this sense of like power, or the narrative makes more sense, or clarity, right? And it's all based on the fact that everyone is like believing the same thing at the same moment, or want to believe the same thing at the same moment. So this idea of like the unseen is kind of an interest to me, like this resonance of these things when they are pulled from their original function, and now they become these kind of speaking tubes, these voice pipes. Like, what are they now, right? What is left? So. Oh, that one's actually, so this is a detail of those pieces so that you can see the various ways that these are constructed.
And so these are made of objects that you cast, and then that you make like a silicone cast?
No, I make
What's the cast made
a
of?
plaster cast.
Plaster cast.
Yeah, so I'm making so in this form, there's like 5 molds. Yeah, on the left, it's about 5 molds, and this one would be like 4 molds. And so these are all individual casts, and basically thinking about like cutting and pasting. So like 3-dimensional collage is how I would think of it. And so what I'm trying to do is to take enough information for that original object, but then through this kind of 3-dimensional collage, what is it now, right? And then this has become kind of indicative of my work, where I'm pigmenting the slip. I use a porcelain slip, and then I'm pigmenting that with color so that it's infused all the way through, right? And so there is kind of this sense of like, what is it even made out of? And for some people could recognize it as ceramic, some people think it's plastic. They don't know what it is all the time.
Yeah,
right?
and that ambiguity is so interesting, because I'm looking at them. They're obviously not fully organic forms. They're sort of hybrids of organic and inorganic forms, which then makes me automatically think that they're human-made. Because in nature, you don't see this mixture of inorganic and organic form. And that ambiguity also sort of functions in terms of our recognition of what the material is too, right? That it's hard to pin down. And let's talk about color. And this like very particular shade of blue.
Well, the blue came from, and actually I'm going to go just with, the blue actually started with this particular project. It's not the first time, but I feel like it maybe coalesced in a way, or like gelled in a way for the next series of work. I was asked to respond to this sign. So there's an art complex, and they were asking artists if they wanted to do something with the sign. And so I was asked, and my first response was no, because I don't do that. I don't do 2D things, so I don't know what I would do. And I was asked again by a curator, like, can you think about it? And so I was thinking about, like, what could I make? And so one thing I was thinking about is that this sign is kind of unseen a lot of times. When you drive by it, like, you can miss it.
Is it because it's too small to be a billboard?
Because it's really like small, and it's not exactly at the entrance. It's like a little bit before you get to the entrance. Yeah. So I was thinking about and the fact that, you know, when you're in this area, artists and creatives, and like there's a coffee shop and there's but like people are in and out of this place all the time. And so if there was a sign that would be very visible at some times and not visible at others. And I was also thinking about this idea of like allyship, because there was a lot of talk about I'm an ally and I'm an ally, and I'm like, are you? And I'm like, you know, like how do you prove that, right? Like how do I know, right? It looks great on Twitter, but so I was thinking about like how there could be a place, or this idea of like getting ready in case that you need to depart, if you need to leave, or if you need to look for allyship. And so I started to use the Underground Railroad, like these patterns that were thought to be used by the Underground Railroad as like these like kind of ways of taking autonomy back from people who are enslaved, right? So they're like, they are the heroes of their own story. Like they're making these decisions. They're coming up with a format to make escape possible.
Yeah,
right?
language.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So a visual language. And so then that is how this kind of formed. And I took a picture of the sky right before sunset began, and then I had them color had the paint made. And so it's interesting because at certain times of day, like I said, it's more visible, and certain times of day it's not. And so now the color has kind of strayed from exactly that, but it kind of started there with this idea of like having these murals act as a place of like thinking about striving, a continual striving for like autonomy and citizenship and freedom, and thinking about what that looks like for myself, and always have that in the forefront of my mind a bit, you know?
And like to make a sign, when I think of like signage as a genre, the whole purpose is legibility. But to make a sign that's like high visibility but it deeply encoded, you know, that's also an interesting kind of, you know, an offering of frustration, right? Like, it's an offering, but of something that one has maybe limited access to.
Well, I thought of it as like, if you know, you know.
Yeah.
Yes, like the people who know gather here, right? So, and yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. And so do you expand the same kind of symbols from the Underground Railroad quilts in these murals here, or are those in response to the objects that are shown with them?
Yeah, it's both. So this was an exhibition, it's called I Am Best When I'm Escaping, and the format of this space is such that it's like a big cube, and so one wall is just all windows. And it's in that same kind of like complex that I was talking about. And so I wanted to be able to make an exhibition, and I almost think of this as like one work, even though there are individual works obviously within the space. But I was thinking about the people who walk past there because they're, you know, the FedEx guy, or because they're going to get coffee, or because they live there and they're walking their dog, or all the people who like may not ever go into the galleries there. Like they may never step foot. And how can I give them, I wanted to, like, you can experience this exhibition without ever opening the door. Like, so I made it with this idea that it's frontal and that you can almost see all of it from the window. And that you can go through kind of like a, like this journey by looking through that window.
That's so interesting, because when I think about sculpture, I think about in the round demand for an experience rather than like a frontality.
Yeah, but I think like if you are on the outside, you have one experience. If you go in, you have a different experience, but you both have an experience, right? And so that kind of became like the one thing that was very kind of interesting to me about like having the show in that particular space. And it's one of those things where I like to be able to play with space in a really kind of like formatted way, depending on like what kind of space it is. And so this was one where I could kind of bring all my practices together, like the individual, more intimate sculpture, and also kind of the installations as well.
And you've talked about, in our earlier conversation, you mentioned other references that the blue, or associations that the blue has. Can we just like unfold some of those?
Oh yeah. So thinking about blue as this kind of color that almost anyone has, it has resonance with almost anyone, right? And so it's a color that's often used in religion. Thinking about Haint blue or the Virgin Mary's blue. Thinking about other artists who've made works in response to this. Yves Klein often talked about his big blue paintings as almost a fourth dimension, a place that, like a plane of color you could fall into.
Oh, I love that.
And it's the sky, it's water, right? So there's something so easily accessible and kind of ways that we all understand blue, I feel like.
Remind us what Haint blue is.
It's like a kind of religious blue for kind of ceremonial in kind of African cultures. And so this idea that it even relates like symbolism of like what you're doing when you're related to that, what you're wearing or where you are with that kind of blue. Yeah.
I remember reading about it because I was researching Betty Saar's work, I think, and like her use of blue too. Reading about it as like in southern African American homes that you would paint the porch ceiling this color blue because it would ward off evil spirits because they were believed not to be able to cross water. Is that? So there are all of these different belief systems in which blue functions as a power, as a force of power, right? And a symbol.
Definitely.
Oh, and are these cast peanuts? Were you making them in the video? You were making.
I am
something
casting peanuts now. These aren't cast. These are actually peanuts. I was thinking about this, like the peanut being, the carver. There's so many places called carver, right? And thinking about like, we think about him as the peanut guy, but like also just he's like he's this person who's thinking about industry and place in a place of like technical industry and education
and labor
right? And so he's thinking about like how can we have our own industry, and so that we are like Black people are self-reliant, right? And then of course there was always like opposing views to that as well, right? About like should you be separate and do these things yourselves, or should you be because you are contributing through your tax dollars, your labor, because you're a citizen, you should not have to do that, right? And so thinking about these kind of opposing thoughts that way, and also I was thinking about like food becomes an interesting cultural touch point. I think for everyone has, when you think about memories, often food is a part of that. And in my family, like boiled peanuts, my dad loved boiled peanuts. And I think it was in reaction to the fact that he no longer lived in the place he grew up. So he grew up in Memphis, and he was actually born on a farm in Mississippi, Mahalia. And there would be trucks that would come up, and they would have sugarcane, watermelon, and boiled peanuts, and other kind of things.
Sentimental treat.
Yeah, sentimental treats that you would get, right? And so I would often go in his car, and there would be, he was a salesman, there would be like shells of the peanut shells. And so thinking about the kind of like these repeating forms that have like both personal but also like cultural or historical meaning.
Great.
And so this is just to give you some idea about the other things that were in the show. And I really thought as people walk through that door that they start on the left and then they kind of wander through. And thinking of it like a portal or a path that you could enter.
And portals describes the map in the
mappings, yeah. So thinking about the negative space of thinking about the negative space on the walls in between the paintings, or even thinking about the stake flags that are placed there. So what is that staking? What is that space that it's being marked?
Well, I want to kind of touch on this concept of portals too, because you're thinking about empowered forms, these kind of rituals of transcendence, kind of magical thinking, infrastructures of emancipation. And I think understanding the portal in this way is really interesting because it's not literally represented as a doorway, right? It's a kind of an imaginary space that you can enter.
I mean, for me, different art forms, whether that was actually being in a museum or listening to music or reading or watching a movie, were all kind of places of departure for me, right? And places for me to be able to see other experiences, see other places that I haven't been to and maybe I would want to go to, right? And it's like we have these moments of like slippage in like this creative like way we experience something. I feel like during COVID, maybe people even became closer to this idea of like how much like art or entertainment really makes an impact on our lives when like you couldn't go outside and you know what I mean, the things that you missed, or even the things that like as I feel like people start to go out a little bit, like the galleries now. I'm just assuming it was the same here. It was like you make an appointment if you want to go to the gallery. You make an appointment, you have an intimate experience in this space to see the work, right?
Yeah, and I'm thinking about like a comment you made in the film about, I think it had to do in some ways with attention, right? With the scarcity of our attention and our ability to just focus. And I love thinking about the artwork as a portal for attention, to lose yourself in history or to lose yourself in an aesthetic experience or to lose yourself in the ambiguity between a recognizable and unrecognizable form of something that's menacing and also familiar. And I think there's, that tension in your work that keeps that space open, which is really exciting.
Yes. I don't know if that was really...
I mostly you probably are too. I'm like, how do we get our students' attention?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it takes time to look. I think that's the important thing, is that it takes time to look. And I think I know myself, I find that I think I've just decided you know what, I can't multitask because I'm not completing the task that I want to complete when I think I'm multitasking. I just need to be focused on the thing that I'm focused on, right? And just have those spaces, those moments. And even having those moments where it doesn't seem like you are doing anything. You need those spaces where you're just sitting silently and just contemplating, or just letting your mind wander, or your eye wander, or your body wander, right? I think that becomes really important.
Which is when you think about, I'm thinking about this in relation to your process, your artistic process, right? That's not what we think of when we think of labor, right? We think of labor as being this productive process, right? But what you're talking about is this kind of immersive, focusing experience of getting lost, but also kind of coming back and I don't know.
I don't know. I think in some labors you do. I mean, I think my mom was a cosmetologist, so she did facials and pedicures and manicures and things like that. And if she wanted to have a conversation with me, she'd offer to give me a manicure or pedicure, because then I'm captured, right? And I'm no, I don't want one. But, in that labor, she was proud of what she was doing. She was giving care to others, right? And, I'm sure she lost herself in what she was doing. Or my aunt who was a cook, or my aunt who was a seamstress. There was a losing yourself into that labor, right, that you're doing. And maybe what is it, the repetitious nature of it, or the fact that you are doing something that someone else is going to wear or to eat, right? Or the fact that you want to show your creativity through these little instances of what you can do through that. I think these, I don't know, I think the way that we think about labor sometimes is too one-to-one for what we're to money, right? So money is part of it, right? But that's
Yeah.
not all it is, right? It's the way that people have, like, they form their identities
Yeah.
as well, and it becomes important to them. And I
Yeah.
think sometimes it gets really downplayed, especially for women. It can be very downplayed about like what you get out of this idea of labor that you choose.
I'm mindful of our time.
Yes.
We have a
Open to the public
Yeah.
if you wish.
Okay. Do you have
yeah.
anything else that you want to show before we open it up?
No, I think I will leave us like on this image in case people have questions.
Any questions? One.
First, thank you so much. Your work is so beautiful. And as a Southerner, I also could resonate with some of your references. We had a conversation earlier about teaching, and your students sound very lucky. And I wanted to ask if your teaching affects your practice at all, and how, what that dialogue looks like, maybe.
Oh, definitely. I'm not someone I didn't fall into teaching when I went to undergrad. I became a ceramics person because that was the professor that invited me into his studio. So that was the person that was the first time I saw like a working artist, and they were also a professor. So it's like this, this is a way to have a life. There's this duality of this thing that can happen. And I have educators in my family, so it felt like very natural to go to also be a teacher. But I'm trying to teach artists, people who want to be artists, how to be an artist, right? And that is a dialogue. That's not like a one-way conversation. And so the experiences that I have, like this, for instance, find their way back into my conversation with my students. The experiences that I'm having now, I want to share with them. And also that the things that I'm asking from them, I need to ask for myself when I'm saying you need to experiment, and you need to be open, and you need to, be present, is the things that I'm saying to them that I'm saying back to myself as well. And yeah, I feel like I learn a lot from them, and from the structure of basically kind of how studio classes are kind of how they're made, how they are not performed, but just even the structure of it is really something that I feel comes back to my studio as well.
Have your students seen your work and responded to it, on view?
Yes, it depends on the students, but I had a student who, at the beginning of the semester, kept looking at me. Every time I looked at them, they were like this, and I was like, what is going on here? And then they fessed up. They were like, I'm on your Instagram account all the time. I'm like, okay, all right, great. So if you have questions for me, yeah, it just depends. I don't like this part, but the idea that I want to know, I'm glad that they understand that when I'm saying things to them, I'm also doing these things, right? And so it is not, I'm practicing the things that I'm telling them to do. I am also doing this, guys. I'm saying you gotta write your artist statement. I also have to write my artist statement, You have to document your work. I have to document, so yeah.
Other questions? 2 questions here. I'll start here.
I was very impressed by your drawings. I would like to ask you if there is a relation, if you built a relation between your drawings and the object you are doing.
The drawings? Yes.
Yes.
And yes. Actually, we'll go to one. Yeah, so the Always and Forever series, and some of the other work as well really becomes a narrative about kind of family narratives, historical narratives. And so I was doing that, but I was doing this in a 3-dimensional way that was kind of more abstract. And I said, and I was like, well, maybe there needs to be a clearer component of these narratives and a way to actually put a kind of the figure back in. but I didn't want the figure to be so like specific, kind of didactic in a way. And so I was really thinking about how could I introduce these figures into my artwork, but still have like a level of like openness and a little bit of like, not abstraction, but like just kind of openness. It's not as clear. And so the drawings kind of came out of that. So I'm looking at family photos and archival photos, and then I'm going in and deconstructing them through software, and then I'm like basically making an image, another image of them, and then I'm having them plotted through a software that actually draws them. So these are like plotted drawings where like a machine kind of comes down. So this idea that even like my hand is not in it in that way, and the fact that the machine will like make mistakes, and that becomes part of what the drawing is, and that like there's this like deconstruction of those original images are the things that I'm kind of interested in with those.
Since we're talking about placing narratives of history through objects, one thing I was really curious about is why the prayer fans. Like, it was one of my favorite works of yours, and I want to know the symbolism behind that.
Yeah, so the prayer fans I've been thinking about a long time. So like I said, I went to Lutheran church. We did not have these fans in church. What we did though, like when I would go to my family's, like my grandmothers or my aunts who were like in Baptist or Pentecostal, they would have these fans. Or if I would go to a funeral, they would have these fans. And I was like always wanted to take these fans home. I was just really obsessed with these fans. And I think it was this idea of like the kind of like, well, one, we didn't have them in our church, but two, it was, you know, usually the name of the church or some church history or the person who had passed away would be on the fan. And this idea of like this everyday kind of like memorial, this thing that is like something that you can toss away, but also can encapsulate like a time or a place or a person, right? And so this idea of the everyday material, it resonates through all my work, and so I started to use masonite, you know, what we usually use as drawing boards, or that people, is the basis of like panels that are for painters and things like that, and having them laser printed, and then making these collages that are transferred onto the works. And so the masonite now becomes like the kind of skin tone when these are transparent. And so they become like, they're not easy to read. You have to get close. And a lot of my work is about that, this idea of like, look, you know, standing back you see one thing, but you really need to like move closer to look and to see what can be seen from that, so. And I always think of them as prayer fans, but I have had a couple people, I had a friend who's like, you know, the mirrors, you know, like those mirrors that you make. And I was like, oh yeah, I mean, yeah, okay, sure, yeah.
Are there other questions here? I do have a question. Going back to your sculptures, from my limited knowledge, when I think of some of those sculptures and the way they are done, and I sense a certain playfulness in them, especially, you know, as ominous as they are, the cones, the way that you displayed, if they are meant to be displayed together, of course I imagine one could acquire one, but as a group, they have a sense almost of marionettes. Or puppets, and then I saw also that in some of your other installations, things were in fact hanging from the ceiling with threads, and those objects that you had there, the ones that are casts of multiple objects, they remind me a lot of, you know, Dada or surrealist assemblages, and this current of playfulness. Is it there also in your work? And if it is, should we take it at face value, or is it turned into something a little sarcastic or political? Like obviously, you know, I wouldn't, much as I love the color of these iconic figures, I don't think I would be very comfortable having one at home.
Really? Why not?
I don't know. People might read, strange meanings into them that are in fact there. But I don't know that I would. I'd be careful in presenting them as an object on a shelf or like it certainly would attract a lot of conversation.
I guess it's really like how comfortable are you with the conversation?
Right.
Right? And so
absolutely.
if you're uncomfortable with the conversation, maybe you're uncomfortable with the object, right?
Perhaps. Yes.
And so, yeah, I mean, I really find it's interesting of like, some people have no hesitation at all. They're like, so they can see like the multiplicity of like the objects, like the different references. But yeah, sometimes it's like, well, like how far this conversation do I have to get, right? But yeah, there's definitely absurdity or some whimsy in it. I even think in the idea of these groupings, there's something like whimsical about some of them, especially if you start looking at the eye holes, because I'm also looking at like masks, like medieval masks, and medieval helmets and things like that. And when you look at the eye holes for some of those, you're like, this was purely a style choice. It has nothing to do with how easy it would be for you to wear this or to be able to see out of it. Or even looking at kind of cartoon characters. There's like a Mushmouth character, which is from like the Fat Albert cartoon. And it really is this thing about like these things are repeating all over the place all the time, right? And so that you can, and that comes through, like what you're saying, is because you've seen it before, right?
And I mean, in Italian culture, it's also like that cone, and it's often associated with these mystical, or not even mystical, they're like groups inside the fraternities inside the Catholic Church that have an importance for maintaining anonymity and which is part also
it's part
of
it,
the clan
rituals, yes.
eventually would
Exactly.
do, but in the Catholic Church it had no racist connotation, so to speak, but of course.
But it did have connotations about power and anonymity.
Because these were corporations oftentimes, and they had certain privileges, and absolutely.
Yep.
And
I think there's absurdity of that, to think the idea that if you put on this thing, like that you're now anonymous and have power, and
none of that makes me comfortable, I have to say. Very well. Any other questions? Wonder.
Thank you. Yes, I wanted to ask you about community practice and collaborations with other artists, and how do you approach that? And we've seen a very short visual from your exhibition at ICOSA. Maybe there are some images from there, but I was curious about those objects and your approach to community practices and what it means to you.
Yeah, I mean, community is really important. When my first teaching job, I was at a large college, but in a small town, and I never felt more miserable in my life. And I realized because I just didn't have any community of artists. And so when I moved to Austin, it was like, I was determined that I would never feel that kind of isolation again. And part of that was to volunteer for organizations, becoming part of this collective, and I'm part of another artist collective as well. And part of ICOSA is that we have these two-person shows, and the artists can collaborate in any way that they wish. And sometimes that's the individual artist just like making their work and coming up with a title, and sometimes it's actually coming up with an idea and then making work that really is made with like a central kind of theme or practice. And so in the video, the show that I had with Erin, she was thinking about this idea of like women's labor, and I was thinking about this, and then we actually kind of shared processes. So the hands, making casts of hands is something that she does in her work. And so we did that, and then she was also using graphite on the top of her pieces. She also casts in metal. And I was just like really loved what the graphite would look like over a surface. And so in these kind of hanging conical figures that I have, I was casting them and then doing this graphite, and they really look like metal. And then she was using a plumb bob that is kind of a plotter, and they're just inverts of each other. So it made a lot of sense to have this kind of installation. And then I was thinking of things like food symbolism or objects of like labor that happen domestically and outside the home. So like my aunt was a cook, and you know, she cooked at home for her family, but she also did it as her job. So things like this, casting the skillets out of porcelain, making impressions inside of like, you know, parts of my hair or of like collard greens or of like fabric, and these kind of like totems, and making an impression and actually like burning them away became kind of like ritualistic. So yeah, I mean, it happens in a variety of ways through projects like that, where I feel like the collective becomes like an experimental space for me. It's a way that I try things first, like showing the videos, like the first place I showed it there, because, you know, that's my experimental phase, to see like how things are going to work. But then there are other things, like I will curate exhibitions with other artists, or coming up with like gatherings or convenings with other artists that I don't, like, are maybe on the side of my practice, but actually help fuel that as well. Any kind of ways to make like dialogue with other artists, I have an interest in.
Oh, one more question?
Yeah. Do you do anything about enticing the public into your gallery, into your studio? It seems to me, I saw your work in Chelsea, and I go to Chelsea a lot to the galleries, and there's hardly anybody there of the general public. It seems to be a world apart, and there doesn't seem to be any mechanism for breaking down that wall between the general public and contemporary art. Do you approach that at all in Austin, Texas?
I guess it just depends. I guess, what do you mean exactly? Like, I mean, I think like when you have an open art opening, right? That's when most people, that's the fullest the gallery is ever going to be, right? But then during the week, there'll be people that'll come in and out to see the work. I don't know. I guess my thing is, like, when I grew up in Chicago, I did not come from an artistic family at all. But galleries and museums were a place where I always felt were open to me, because, you know, as a student, like, you'd pay almost nothing. And when I was in the art, like, when I would go to the Art Institute, there would always be like, usually there would be like some gallery guard that would just be like, just come on in, right? And galleries were free. And so you have to feel comfortable to think that that space is for you. So I would say that, like, you have to feel like that space is open for you. But you do have to, like, enter. You have to make a decision to enter. And it's often much more individualistic decision than, for instance, like going to a sporting event or going to a concert or going to, like, you know, or like going to the movies, because those are things that you think of as like group activities, right? And that you can see at home too, right? You can see the sporting event at home. And museums and galleries, it takes a want and an effort by the person to want to go. And so I don't feel like everyone has to go, but if you have an interest, they are there for you. Yeah.
Oh, there was a question in front, maybe?
I had a question.
Oh, okay. And then maybe we can move to...
Great. Tammie, this is about the sign piece, the Underground Railroad sign. And it's really just a kind of a technical question about, I noticed in the photograph that it's a railroad crossing, right? Mm-hmm. So that's specifically, so it was site-specific to that, or you created it, or just coincidentally?
Oh, that there's a railroad there?
Yeah.
No, I mean, I didn't create the railroad.
Right. But knowing the sign was there, and then that your
I mean,
concept
it was in my mind, because if I would leave...
It seems so perfect.
I would leave at, so my studio used to be here.
Okay.
And if I left about like 9:45, the train would come and I would just be sitting there and I would always be like, oh my God, I forgot. And, like every time it happened, I'd be like, I can't believe I forgot. So yeah, this idea that we're in a place of like transit is definitely kind of like part of that.
But you're using Underground Railroad symbolism
No, I wasn't.
next to a railroad.
Yeah, no, I wasn't thinking that
Okay,
specifically.
okay.
No. That is like nice. That's a happy happenstance, but
There you go.
no.
Okay, fair
I wish
enough.
I was like that, like strategic.
You can, from here, this point on, you can say yeah.
That would be funny. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for this wonderful conversation. Thank you, Tammie and Ellen, and maybe we can continue it in front of some Prosecco.
All right. Thanks, everybody.